This coupon is valid. Read the fine print. If customer service fails, I'm the escalation.
Every family has a secret. My family's secret is about 5'4", has a cloud of perfectly coiffed white hair, and can make a grown CEO cry with a single glance. The internet has a name for her, a Karen. I just call her Grandma. For years, every trip to the grocery store with her was an exercise in pure, unadulterated cringe. But I eventually discovered a shocking truth. My greatest source of social anxiety was actually my family's most powerful secret weapon. Over the next hour, we're going on a journey. I'm going to show you how this woman went head-to-head with shady mechanics, billion-dollar corporations, and the American healthcare system itself, and won. We'll uncover the surprisingly emotional origin story that forged her into a warrior, and I'll share the exact moment my shame turned into absolute awe. It's a story that makes me think this can't just be my family. I have a theory that these women are a global force of nature, a secret society of grandmothers who refuse to back down. So, right at the start, I want you to join me in a little experiment. If you have a grandma with this same superpower, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I have a feeling we're about to see a pattern. Because by the end of this, I promise you, you'll not only understand my grandma, you'll be wishing you had one just like her. So, what exactly turns a sweet, loving grandmother, a woman who makes an apple pie so good it could broker world peace, into a force of nature so powerful that retail managers must feel a faint chill run down their spine when her car pulls into the parking lot? After years of close and often terrified observation, I've come to realize that her methods aren't just random acts of assertiveness. They are a science. It's a PhD-level curriculum in consumer warfare, and today, class is in session. It all starts with her foundational technique, a move I've come to call the surgical receipt scrutiny. For you and me, a receipt is a piece of thermal paper destined to become linty trash in a coat pocket. For Grandma, it's a legally binding contract that she analyzes with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. I've seen it happen 100 times. We'll be at the checkout, the transaction is complete, and the poor, unsuspecting cashier will hand her the receipt with a cheerful, "Have a nice day." That's when the show begins. She'll pull her glasses down from the top of her head, hold the receipt at a precise distance, and her finger will begin to trace each line item. Artichoke hearts, check. Organic kale, check. Greek yogurt. And then the pause, a dramatic, earth-shattering pause. Her head tilts slightly. "Excuse me, dear," she'll say, her voice calm but firm. "This coupon for the yogurt was for 75 cents off, not 50. My soul will literally try to leave my body. I'd pay $1 just to make the 25-cent discrepancy disappear. But for her, it's not about the quarter. It's a tiny tear in the fabric of commercial integrity, and she is the cosmic tailor sent to stitch it shut. Now, if the paper trail proves insufficient, she seamlessly escalates to her second, more ethereal technique, the manager summoning stare. This is her silent, tactical weapon, and honestly, it's a thing of beauty. There's no shouting, no demanding to see a manager. It's far more sophisticated. She simply finds the nearest employee, usually some fresh-faced teenager named Chad, full of youthful optimism, and she fixes him with the stare. It's a complex cocktail of emotions. It's about 20% "I'm not angry, I'm just profoundly disappointed," 30% "I've seen empires rise and fall, and this is not how you handle a yogurt coupon," and a full 50% "The natural order of the universe has been disrupted, and you, Chad, are now the focal point of its correction." The employee's smile falters. Their confidence evaporates. They are looking into the eyes of a woman who remembers a time before barcodes and is deeply unimpressed by the technology. Without another word being spoken, they instinctively know their pay grade is no match for this level of psychic pressure. They turn on their heel and go find the manager. It works, every single time. But her magnum opus, the technique that truly defines her genius, is her mastery of the paper trail of justice. Let me tell you the legend of the toaster. A few years ago, our family's beloved toaster, Old Faithful, finally gave up the ghost in a sad puff of smoke. We held a brief, silent memorial and prepared to enter the 5 stages of grief and buy a new one. But Grandma simply said, "Hold on a minute." She descended into the garage, a domestic archaeological site of forgotten Christmas decorations and half-finished projects. Minutes later, she emerged, dusty but triumphant, holding a faded, crinkled but perfectly legible receipt. It was dated almost 3 years to the day. I watched, mesmerized, as she marched back into that big box store, presented the ancient document, and walked out with a brand new toaster. She taught me a vital lesson that day. A receipt isn't just a piece of paper, it's a contract, it's proof. In her hands, it's a weapon. And for the longest time, I just thought these were her hilarious, slightly terrifying hobbies. Little skirmishes in the Great War of Customer Service. I dismissed them as petty battles she fought for the thrill of the win. I was so wrong. I had no idea that I was watching her train, honing these very skills for a fight that wasn't about a 50-cent coupon or a broken toaster, but one that would determine the future of our family. My grandma wasn't always like this. She wasn't born with a factory-installed radar for spotting managerial weakness or a spine forged from tungsten. The woman my mother describes from her childhood was softer, quieter, the kind of person who believed a firm handshake and a person's word were as good as gold. She was the type to bake a welcome to the neighborhood casserole for a new family before they had even unpacked their boxes. But there was a single event, a defining crucible in her life that burned away that gentle trust and forged something much harder, much sharper in its place. This is the chapter of her life that explains everything. To truly understand her, you have to travel back with me to the 1980s, an era of big hair and even bigger shoulder pads. My grandparents, after years of scrimping and saving every spare dollar, had finally amassed enough money to build a small extension on their modest house. This wasn't just about adding a room. It was the physical embodiment of the American dream for them. It was going to be a sunroom, a little slice of heaven where my grandma could grow her orchids and where they could sit and drink iced tea in the summer. They found a local contractor who had this folksy, irresistible charm. He called my grandpa Chief, sketched out their dreams on a napkin right at their kitchen table, and made them feel like they were his only clients in the world. Trusting in his promises and his seemingly honest face, they handed over a check that represented nearly their entire life savings. At first, everything was exciting. The sound of construction was the sound of progress. But then the work slowed down, the excuses started. A supplier was late, the weather wasn't right, a problem with a permit. The phone calls that were once answered on the first ring started taking a day to be returned, then a week, then not at all. My grandpa would drive by the site on his way home from work, only to see it sitting silent and abandoned, with half-finished walls and lumber left warping in the rain. The truth dawned on them slowly, then all at once, like a cold wave of nausea. The charming contractor was a fraud. He had taken their money and left them with a half-destroyed home and a hollowed-out bank account. I learned later that the experience didn't just make my grandmother angry. It made her feel ashamed. She felt that she had failed in her duty to protect her family, that her trusting nature had been a weakness that a predator had exploited. And in that moment of feeling utterly powerless, watching her husband's heart break over their shattered dream, something inside her calcified. It was the cold, hard realization that the world wasn't always a kind place, and that being nice and avoiding confrontation wasn't a virtue, it was a vulnerability. If she didn't fight, if she didn't learn to be loud, to be demanding, to be her family's unyielding advocate, then no one else would. This is the generational divide I could never grasp when I was younger. My generation was raised to solve problems through a carefully worded email or a passive-aggressive one-star Yelp review. We are digital snipers, picking off our grievances from the safe distance of a keyboard. Her generation, the baby boomers, were the infantry. They were taught that if you had a problem, you looked a person square in the eye and you handled it right then and there. There was no screen to hide behind. Her assertiveness isn't rooted in entitlement, it's forged in the fire of survival. And that contractor, the man who unknowingly lit the fuse on this particular stick of dynamite, his role in our family's story wasn't quite over. He would have to face my grandmother again, years later, not across a dusty, half-finished construction site, but in a place where he was just as vulnerable as she had once been. This is the moment my embarrassment died a sudden and violent death. This is the moment I stopped cringing and started taking notes. This is the story of a broken air conditioner, a sweltering July, and my grandmother versus a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Once upon a time, in the middle of a brutal heat wave, my parents bought a brand new, top-of-the-line central air conditioning unit. It was a glorious, magnificent beast. For one perfect week, our house was a cool oasis of calm while the world outside melted. We felt safe. We felt secure, and then on a Tuesday it just stopped. The silence was deafening, followed quickly by the creeping, oppressive heat that seeps into your bones and makes you miserable. And so began the daily ritual of calling the warranty department. Every day, my dad or I would spend an hour navigating the automated phone maze, listening to that same, tinny hold music that is scientifically engineered to chip away at your sanity. Every day, we would finally get through to a polite but completely powerless customer service agent who would offer us their sincerest apologies. They would promise a call back from a technician within 24 to 48 business hours, a unit of time that apparently has no meaning on planet Earth. The house got hotter, the air grew thick and heavy. We were sleeping with wet towels on our foreheads. We were defeated, resigned to our sweaty fate. Until one day, on day 8 of this hostage situation, my grandma, who had been watching this whole saga unfold with a look of quiet intensity, simply put down her knitting needles. She looked at my dad, who was slumped over the kitchen table in defeat, and said the 5 words that would change everything. "Give me the phone." And because of that, a masterclass began. I expected yelling. I expected a tirade. What I got was a cold, calculated, strategic assault. She didn't raise her voice once. With the warranty booklet open in front of her like a sacred text, she got a customer service agent on the line and calmly began her ascent up the corporate ladder. She would ask for a name, wait for the response, and then say, "Thank you, Sarah. Now I need you to transfer me to your immediate supervisor." When they would try to divert her, she would calmly quote, word for word from Section 3, Paragraph B of the Platinum Warranty Agreement regarding expedited service for total system failure. It was mesmerizing. She wasn't a Karen complaining. She was a lawyer presenting her opening argument. She climbed past 7 different levels of management, leaving a trail of baffled but compliant employees in her wake. She never lost her cool, she never wavered. She just stated facts and quoted their own policies back at them. Until finally, she reached a vice president of customer relations, a man who clearly had not spoken to an actual customer in about a decade. There was a long pause on the other end of the line after she laid out her case. You could almost hear the sound of him sweating, and just like that, the war was over. Within 2 hours, not one but 2 senior technicians were at our door, not in a regular van, but in the emergency response vehicle. They fixed the unit in under an hour. But the story doesn't end there. The next day, my dad got a call from that same vice president, personally apologizing. And as a gesture of goodwill for our unacceptable ordeal, the company paid our entire electricity bill for that month. That was the day I learned the profound difference between complaining and advocating. It's not about being loud. It's about being right, being prepared, and being absolutely relentless until the job is done. You think negotiating a free month of electricity from a corporate giant is peak performance? That was just a warm-up. Now, let me tell you what happens when my grandmother goes to war with a shady mechanic who made the single biggest mistake of his career. Thinking a senior citizen was an easy target. Her car, a trusty old Buick that's practically a member of the family, started making a strange sound. It was a faint but persistent clinking noise that worried her. She took it to a new auto shop that had just opened up down the street, one with a flashy sign promising honest, old-fashioned service. An hour later, the mechanic came out, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He had that look on his face, a practiced, somber expression that's meant to prepare you for financial devastation. He started throwing around a lot of technical jargon, words like catalytic transponder and serpentine modulator, which I'm pretty sure he just made up. The bottom line, he said gravely, was that the problem was severe, and it was going to cost $2,000 to fix. Now, an ordinary person might have felt a wave of panic and just handed over their credit card. A stereotypical Karen might have started screaming about being ripped off. My grandmother did neither. She just looked him in the eye, her expression unreadable, and a long silence hung in the air. You could see the mechanic's confidence start to waver just a little under her calm, steady gaze. Finally, she just nodded slowly and said, I see. Thank you for your diagnosis. I'll need some time to consider it, and she walked out. No arguing, no drama, just a quiet, strategic retreat, but she wasn't going home to consider it. She was going on an intelligence-gathering mission. For the rest of the afternoon, she drove that clinking Buick to 3 other well-respected garages in town, places her friends had gone to for years. At each one, she didn't just ask for a price. She paid for a full, written diagnostic report and a detailed, itemized quote. She was building her case, collecting irrefutable evidence from his own peers. The next morning, she walked back into the first shop. The shady mechanic saw her and a greasy smile spread across his face, clearly thinking she was back to approve the $2,000 job. She walked right up to the counter and without a single word placed her 3 pieces of evidence down in a neat row. Thwack, 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 3 official reports, 3 quotes, none of them for more than $200 to fix a loose heat shield. She let him read them. Then in a low, even voice that was far more terrifying than any shout, she delivered her ultimatum. We have 2 ways of resolving this, she said. We can handle this quietly and professionally, right here, right now. Or my very next phone calls will be to the Better Business Bureau and the State Attorney General's office to file a formal complaint for predatory practices against senior citizens. It's your choice. The color drained from his face. It was a checkmate. He started stammering, backpedaling so fast he nearly tripped over a toolbox. Suddenly, he double-checked the system and realized he'd made a terrible mistake. He not only fixed her car on the spot, he did it for free, practically begging her not to make those calls. And that's when I truly understood her power. This wasn't rage. This wasn't an outburst. This was a calculated, strategic execution based on preparation, evidence, and the intelligent use of leverage. It was glorious. But I'd be lying if I said this secret weapon didn't occasionally have some friendly fire casualties, including on one very memorable occasion, my entire dating life. But every weapon has a blast radius. And to be brutally, painfully honest, there have been times I've been caught in the explosion and wished I could activate some kind of personal cloaking device. Because her finely tuned sense of justice doesn't have an off switch, it triggers just as fiercely for a minor social infraction as it does for a major corporate crime. Let me paint you a picture. We go to the movies, a simple, happy family outing. I'm excited. My grandma goes to the concession stand and orders a large popcorn. She takes one bite, and then she freezes, her eyes narrow. She walks back to the counter where a 16-year-old kid is just trying to survive his Friday night shift. She doesn't yell, she does something far worse. She starts to coach him. Young man, she says, holding out the bucket. Let's talk about the butter to salt ratio. The boy just stares, his mind a blank canvas of terror. You see, she continues, the salt here isn't just excessive, it's disrespectful. It shows a lack of care for the popcorn, for the moviegoer, for the entire cinematic experience. She made that poor kid feel like he had personally let down the entire legacy of Hollywood, all because he had a heavy hand with the salt shaker. I bought my own popcorn after that. And that's the blurry, complicated line she sometimes crosses without even realizing it. There's a fine wire difference between being an advocate and being a bully. And in her relentless pursuit of the right way, she sometimes forgets that the person on the other side is just a kid earning minimum wage, not a hostile corporate entity. Her intentions are always pure, but the execution can be devastating, and I have never felt that devastation more acutely than on the night she single-handedly destroyed my dating life. I was in college, and I had brought a girl I really liked home to meet the family. A first date at a nice restaurant. I was nervous. I was trying to be smooth, and it was going well until the waiter came to our table. He was a perfectly nice young man, but he made a tiny, imperceptible error. He placed my date's fork about half an inch too close to her knife. My grandmother saw it, and her internal justice alarm went off. She stopped her own meal, gently cleared her throat, and turned what was supposed to be a date into a free, unsolicited, and deeply uncomfortable training seminar on proper table setting. Now, dear, she said to the waiter, who looked like he wanted to be beamed up by aliens, let's review the fundamentals. The bread plate, as you know, always goes to the upper left. My date just sat there, eyes wide, with this look of fascinated horror, like she was watching a National Geographic special about a lion teaching its cub how to hunt. The relationship did not survive to a second date. So yes, this secret weapon can be a blunt instrument. It taught me that power, even power used for good, needs to be wielded with grace and responsibility. But I will take 1,000 ruined dates and a lifetime of public embarrassment. Because all of that shame means nothing when you're faced with a real monster. And our family was about to face the biggest one of all, the American healthcare system. But I will take 1,000 ruined dates and a lifetime of public embarrassment. I will endure a million lectures on the proper buttering of popcorn, because all of that shame means nothing when you're faced with a real monster. And our family was about to face the biggest, most confusing monster of all, a hospital bill. My dad had a routine procedure, something minor that was supposed to be fully covered by insurance. A few weeks later, the envelope arrived. You know the one, it's thick, it's heavy, it feels like it contains bad news that has its own gravitational pull. My dad opened it and I just watched the color drain from his face. The number at the bottom was astronomical. It was more than a new car. It was filled with pages of medical codes that looked like a foreign language and charges that defied all logic. There were things like $150 for oral administration fee, which is apparently the cost for a nurse to hand you a pill. There was a charge for 3 boxes of tissues we never even used. We were devastated. My dad, a man who has worked hard his entire life, just sighed and put his head in his hands. Well, he said quietly, I guess we'll just have to figure out a payment plan. We were ready to surrender. And that's when my grandmother entered the kitchen, picked up the bill, and her entire demeanor changed. The playful critic was gone. The quirky complainer vanished. In her place stood a 5-star general reviewing a battlefield map. The kitchen table became her command center. For the next 2 weeks, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, she made it her full-time job. She had the phone on speaker, a legal pad for notes, the insurance policy booklet, and a bottomless pot of coffee. But her real weapon this time was a weapon of the modern age, an Excel spreadsheet. She created columns for the date, the time of the call, the name and department of the person she spoke to, and a brutally honest summary of the conversation. It was a masterpiece of data-driven warfare. She spent days on the phone, getting bounced between the hospital's billing department and the insurance company. Each one blamed the other in an endless, infuriating loop. But she wasn't just listening, she was gathering data. She was finding the cracks in their stories. And then late one afternoon it happened. The plot twist. While cross-referencing a line item from the hospital with the insurance company's explanation of benefits, she found it. A single 8-digit billing code that was off by one number. It wasn't a typo. The hospital had coded my dad's routine procedure as a far more complex, experimental one, a code that their system knew insurance wouldn't fully cover. She realized this wasn't just a mistake on our bill, it was a systemic error. The next phone call she made was different. She wasn't asking questions anymore, she was giving a presentation. She calmly and methodically walked a director in the hospital's finance department through her spreadsheet, pointing out the systemic flaw she had discovered. The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. The result? 90% of the bill was wiped away instantly. More than that, she forced them to launch an internal audit of that billing code, an action that likely saved countless other families from the same nightmare. That was the moment I finally understood. She wasn't a Karen, she was a warrior. All those years, all those little battles over toasters and salty popcorn and crooked forks, that was just her training. This was her championship fight. That's when I realized she wasn't fighting with a waiter, she was fighting for her family. We've talked a lot about the Karen. We've dissected her methods and marveled at her strategies. Now I want to talk about my grandma, because the same woman who can make a grown man tremble with a single look is the reason I learned how to read properly. In 2nd grade, I was a quiet kid, lost in the back of a crowded classroom and falling behind. My parents were worried, but they didn't know what to do. My grandma did. She scheduled a meeting with the principal. I don't know what was said in that office. I just know that 1 week later, I was moved into a smaller class with the most patient, wonderful teacher in the entire school, a woman who took the time to help me sound out the words. My grandma didn't see a bureaucratic problem. She saw her grandson struggling, and she moved heaven and earth to fix it for him. Years later, when it was time for me to buy my first car, I found a beat-up but reliable old sedan on a used car lot. I scraped together every dollar I had from my summer job, and I managed to haggle the price down by a couple $100. I was so proud of myself. It wasn't until years later that my dad let it slip. The reason the salesman gave in so easily was because my grandma had visited the dealership the day before I did. She had a private conversation with the manager about what a fair price would be for her grandson, who was a good boy working so hard. She used her secret weapon, not for a public spectacle, but secretly, silently, to make sure I wouldn't get taken advantage of. She made sure I could afford my first taste of freedom. That fierce, demanding, relentless energy that the world sees as a Karen is just the external expression of a deep, primal, protective love. It's the same fire. It's just pointed in a different direction. That's the woman behind the label. She's the smell of cinnamon and apple pie that hits you the second you walk through her front door. She's the sound of a hearty laugh that can fill an entire room. She's the person whose house always feels like the safest harbor in any storm. She's the woman who taught me that you never, ever give up on the people you love. The internet loves simple, easy labels because they let us judge without understanding. But people aren't labels, they're stories. And the woman the world might call a Karen is, to me, a complex and beautiful story of survival, of loyalty, and of a love so fierce it refuses to back down. Which leads me inevitably to the most existentially terrifying question a person can ask themselves. Is the Karen gene hereditary? Is it a dormant sequence in my DNA, just waiting for the right combination of poor customer service and a bad day to activate? For most of my adult life, I have operated under the assumption that I was blessedly immune. I have actively curated a personality that is the polar opposite of my grandmother's in public. I am a world-class conflict avoider. I am the kind of person who would receive a completely different meal than I ordered and just eat it silently, convincing myself that actually I wanted the fish all along. I've apologized to inanimate objects I've bumped into. I saw myself as the antidote to her energy, but recently I found myself in a situation that triggered a disturbing and surprisingly empowering internal crisis. I had ordered a bookshelf online. It wasn't just any bookshelf. It was the one I'd been saving up for, the one that was going to finally help me organize my life and officially make me feel like a real adult. Weeks went by. I did the modern-day ritual of refreshing the tracking page 5 times a day, watching the little digital dot make its journey, only for it to end with a bold, cheerful delivered. Except it wasn't. My porch was empty. My hallway was barren. The old me would have sighed, accepted the universe's cruel joke, and resigned myself to a life of floor-level book piles. But as I sat there, stewing in my defeat, a strange new sensation bubbled up from deep within my soul. It was a quiet but firm voice in the back of my head, and it sounded uncannily like my grandma. And it whispered, "Are you really just going to let them keep your money, honey?" So I picked up the phone. I could feel my heart pounding. But as I dialed, I also did something else. I opened a document on my computer. I put the order number at the top. I took a screenshot of the delivery confirmation page. I was building my case file just like she would. When a very nice agent named Brenda answered, I didn't yell. I didn't make accusations. I channeled my grandmother's spirit, but I ran it through my own, more diplomatic filter. I explained the situation calmly and clearly. When Brenda offered the standard, vague "will launch an investigation," I didn't let it end there. "Brenda, I really appreciate you doing that," I said. "So I can keep track on my end, could I please get a reference number for this investigation?" I asked for the next specific step. I was polite, I was empathetic, but I was also persistent. I was using her tactics, preparation, documentation, and a calm but firm refusal to be dismissed. 2 days later, my beautiful bookshelf arrived, and I felt this jolt of pride that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. That's when I understood the legacy. I wasn't becoming a Karen 10. That model is the original hardware. It's powerful, it's effective, but the operating system can be a bit buggy and prone to loud, aggressive pop-ups. I am hopefully becoming a Karen 20. It's a software upgrade. It runs on the same powerful core belief that you deserve to be treated fairly, but it has a more user-friendly interface. It's coded with empathy. It's about achieving the same result but with less collateral damage to the 16-year-old at the concession stand. That is her true inheritance. It's not about winning every minor battle. It's about having the skills and the self-respect to fight the important ones when you have to. She taught me that you don't have to yell to be heard. You just have to be prepared, be persistent, and believe that your voice matters. And that's a lesson worth carrying on. So what does this secret weapon actually look like in day-to-day life, away from the high-stakes battles with corporate giants and shady mechanics? What happens when that same energy is applied to the small, ordinary moments? Well, it looks a little something like this. It looks like the time we had a new wardrobe delivered and the assembly guy was just trying to get it done. My grandma didn't just let him work. She pulled up a chair and began to supervise, which was really more like co-piloting. She had the instruction manual in her lap like she was studying scripture. "Now, are you sure that's screw C and not screw D?" She'd ask, her voice full of genuine concern. The diagram suggests D might offer superior long-term structural integrity. The poor guy just looked at her, then at the screw, then back at her, and you could see the moment he realized it was just easier to do it her way. She wasn't being difficult, she just operates on a core belief that if something is worth doing, it is worth doing correctly. It looks like a Saturday morning at Costco. The free sample stations are a minefield for most people, but for my grandma, they are a series of tiny performance reviews. She will approach the little table, accept the tiny paper cup with a morsel of sausage in it, and her entire demeanor will shift. She becomes a world-renowned food critic. She'll look at it, maybe sniff it, and then take a bite with a thoughtful, serious expression. She chews slowly, her eyes closed in deep concentration. Then there's a long, dramatic pause before she delivers her verdict to the person handing them out. The texture is quite pleasant, she'll pronounce, but the spice profile feels a little hesitant. It needs more confidence. She says it with such authority, you'd think she was a judge on a cooking show, not just a lady in the freezer aisle. But then, the secret weapon looks like this. It looks like the day I got my college acceptance letter. I was so excited I could barely breathe. The first person I told was my grandma. She didn't just say congratulations. She wrapped me in a hug so tight and so fierce it felt like it could protect me from anything the world could ever throw at me. It was a hug that felt like a fortress. And in that moment, I felt the exact same energy she uses to fight with mechanics and hospital administrators, but this time it was directed entirely at me, as a shield of pure, unconditional love. It's all the same fire, and sometimes it looks like a moment that has nothing to do with our family at all. We were in line at a pharmacy, and a young tourist ahead of us was clearly flustered, struggling to explain what she needed to a very impatient clerk. The clerk was sighing and rolling her eyes. My grandma just took one step forward, didn't say a word to the clerk, but gently touched the young woman's arm and said in a calm, steady voice, "Take your time, dear, it's all right." That's all it took. The entire energy of the situation shifted. The clerk's impatience dissolved under my grandma's steady gaze. She wasn't fighting for a refund or a better deal. She was fighting for a stranger's dignity. So when you strip away the memes and the jokes, what are you really left with? What does this label Karen actually mean in the end? So in the end, after all the stories, is Karen really an insult? I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about the condescending tone it's used with and the entitled behavior it rightfully calls out. And here's what I've realized. Maybe the world needs fewer people who scream at overworked employees over things that don't matter. That's absolutely true. But it definitely needs more people who are willing to speak up when something is fundamentally wrong. It needs more people who will stand in the gap, prepared and fearless for those who can't. We need more people who will protect the people they love at all costs, who refuse to let their family be pushed around, taken advantage of, or silenced. If that's what a Karen is, then maybe we've been using the word wrong this whole time. The world can call her what it wants. It can see the memes, it can hear the jokes, it can slap a label on her. But for me, Karen is just another word for love. It's a fierce, stubborn, unapologetic, and absolutely relentless kind of love. It's the kind of love that will march into battle for you, whether the enemy is a $2,000 fraudulent car repair or a 50-cent error on a grocery bill. It's the kind of love that always has your back. That's my story. Now I want to hear yours. Who is the secret weapon in your family? Maybe it's a quiet uncle who can fix literally anything with just a roll of duct tape and some string. Maybe it's an older sister who always gives you brutally honest but perfect advice. Or maybe you have a grandma just like mine. Tell me about the unsung hero in your family. Share your story in the comments below because these are the stories that deserve to be told. And if this video made you see someone in your own life a little differently today, if it made you look beyond the label, then please give it a like and subscribe. Because our journey of discovering the real, complex, and beautiful human stories behind the stereotypes has only just begun.